In the second installment of Module 2, we're going to talk a little bit about violence in sport. Violence in sport is kind of an interesting thing because, you know, we're coming out of this discussion of deviance and crime and all that kind of stuff, and when you think about the types of sports that we really heavily consume, not only here in the United States but also globally, there's an underlying sense of violence contained within them, and it kind of goes back to the beginning of competition, and oftentimes the early forms of sporting competitions were kind of in antiquity were warriors that were practicing. And so you have the javelin, which is essentially just throwing a spear. You have wrestling, you have chariot races, and then ways of demonstrating that the physical body is at peak and utmost condition, you know, wrestling, running, those types of things. So at its very core, there's a strong kind of positive relationship with violence, but our purpose is, when we start looking at and trying to understand violence, is trying to create a meaning around what violence is considered deviant, what violence is sanctioned, and so on and so forth. So in order to do that, we need a couple more conceptual tools that we'll talk about here in this particular installment. And one is simply just the definition of violence. It seems very commonsensical, but we all have slightly different definitions, and these small modifications between these definitions could down the line create problems. So it's kind of nice to have one working definition that we can all understand, at least the context for what violence in sport is. So definition of violence: the use of excessive physical force which causes or has a potential to cause harm and or destruction. Now, there's a couple of polemical words there, you know, destruction obviously being one, but also we're not just talking about physical force in the game, we're talking something that's excessive. All right, and so when we talk about violence, that's going to be juxtaposed to the violent nature of already consumed sports. We know football, there's a violent component to it, but when we talk about violence in football, we're going to talk about those things that go above and beyond that taken for granted physical, brutal force of the game. Well, okay, so, if violence isn't always bad, because sometimes it's okay, then we have to kind of keep in our mind straight that, okay, you can engage and be a very, very violent person, but not actually step outside the bounds of a sport. Is that considered deviant? And that's a very, very difficult question. Also, we have this sort of stereotypical view that, you know, if you engage in a very violent sport, you can't, quote unquote, turn it off. You know, how come? Well, a lot of people point towards, you know, if you're involved and you excel in very violent athletics, then that's kind of part of this tradition of ritual sport, which is born out of violence, and as a result, a certain type of personality gravitates towards it, and can be very, very successful in it if they take and kind of embody these characteristics of violence and, you know, the macho masculinity type thing. And I just want to take real quick, I don't know, it was a few years ago, there was on the Discovery Channel, they had this show, The Last One Standing, where it was, you know, another addition to reality TV, but the idea was you took these individuals and they competed in all of these ancient ritual sports in different cultures and different tribes around the world. So let's just watch this real quickly and see if I can get it pulled up. Try to pull it up ahead of time so we don't have to watch the Home Depot commercial at the beginning. Now, when looking at something like that, and it's like anything else, it's a reality TV show, but I want you to pull little bits and pieces from it. I mean, you can obviously see there's components of violence, which is not, it's violent, but it's not necessarily bad in those particular contexts. There's that notion when he was talking about one of the participants has an aggression problem, and it's a beautiful thing. Well, that kind of gets to this notion that those people that participate in these very physical and brutal sports have a warped understanding of violence, and it oftentimes is going to be exacerbated by the machismo or that male-centric culture that tends to be so pervasive within individual and team-oriented sports, especially here in the United States. And if you remember talking about the sport ethic, we talked about Deviance, and Hughes and Coakley, these are the 4 core norm values of power and performance sports, and it's kind of what sort of sets the stage for conforming, over-conforming, or under-conforming. And it talks about the fact that people will pursue no limits in the pursuit of possibilities, and there's a sense of wanting to conform and be a part of something. Well, the interesting thing is that if you take the sport ethic and you kind of combine it with an understanding of violence, what you get is a lot of people that accept a very, very violent part of these brutal games, and realize that it's one way of, while conforming, because everyone's going to do it, but it's also one way of receiving distinction. A few years ago, Monday Night Football, they would have this segment called Jacked Up, and they would show the big hits from the previous Sunday, and it was a big deal, and it was kind of fun. And if you think of ESPN and the top 10 plays, most of the times these are what French postmodernist theorist Baudrillard would call the spectacular. He talks about the spectacle and how society is involved in the spectacle and so on and so forth. And it's kind of interesting because things that are spectacular, that's what draws our attention, and that's what the media is predicated upon. And we're not scapegoating the media here by any means, but what's going to be quote-unquote spectacular? Well, it's probably going to be these different forms of quasi and criminal violence, some borderline violence, just things that are really noticeable and out of the norm of very, very brutal contests. But when you think about that, there's a lot of people that benefit from that. The media benefits from players buying into this model. The fans benefit from it because in terms of excitement in a product, it's very, very exciting and easy to consume this particular product. We grow up, at least here in the United States, it's a very, very violent country, and so there's no surprise that our sports are going to be fairly violent as well. And so an aspect of violence is going to enhance the excitement, the drama, and you're able to see emotions play out in an individual and much more of a team concept. Well, okay, and that's all well and good, and it kind of, as you read through those points and such, it kind of gets a little confusing because we keep talking about violence and violent behavior and all that, and on-field versus off-field violence. And so 1983 and 1986, a lawyer named Michael Smith started creating these categories as a way of just trying to understand on-field or on playing surface, whatever you want to say, violence within certain sports. Now he drew the parameters of on-field, on-court, on ice, that kind of thing, so that we knew exactly what we're talking about, things that occurred during the contest. And he came up with these 4 rather simple categories or typologies, which these things are not perfect, but there's genius in the simplicity here, in that it just gives us a starting point, a place for centering a discussion regarding violent behavior and trying to compare and contrast different forms of violence on the field within some of these sports, which we do anecdotally anyway. But if we want to make sure that we have a clear, concise, kind of social scientific based approach, we need to have some categories and ways of differentiating these things, and that's what he developed. Brutal body contact, exactly what it sounds like. It's kind of the it's a generalized agreement. We all understand that certain sports have a physical, a brutal component to them, and as long as it's confined within the rules, football, Smash Mouth football, it's a great example. As long as it's confined to the rules, then it's something we all accept and that we all agree is part of the game. And this is here, right over here. You just have, sometimes in the game of football or rugby or lacrosse or wrestling, there is a sense of physicality that's just part and parcel to it. Borderline violence is something that it violates the rules of the game, okay, but it's more or less accepted by the people that participate in that sport, and fans kind of and coaches accept it, that type of thing. So you may get penalized within the contest, if you're throwing elbows in basketball or different things in football. Certain types of hits are going to be illegal, and maybe you're fined, or not fined, but penalized 15 yards for certain types of things. So it goes against the quote-unquote rules of the game, but the players accept that it's going to be part of the game any given day that they play. Now we start getting to quasi-criminal and criminal violence, and this is where it gets a little bit more complicated, because quasi-criminal, we're talking about violations that are clearly outside of the game, and these violations may result in some sort of sanctions by a governing body. We just don't necessarily know what it's going to be. Okay, well, what constitutes a cheap shot, for example? Well, it depends upon the sport. But let's say if we're talking about football and the current state of the game in the NFL, ways of hitting people. It's a very violent game, but they've tried to legislate, quote unquote, the types of hits on defenseless receivers, on quarterbacks, things you can't do and cannot do. If two linemen are engaged, holding and that kind of thing, blocking or trying to get to the quarterback, then you can't dive at the opponent's knees and that type of thing. Okay. And you could be fined for those things. And again, the fine and the governing body has some leeway in terms of how to control and curb that. Criminal violence is violence that are clearly outside of the game and may be prosecuted as crimes. And this is kind of landmark. When in the 90s you started to see this shift where things that were obviously premeditated, things that were clearly not supposed to happen in, say, a hockey game, for example, with Marty McSorley and what he did to Donald Brashear. You have the surrounding community that says, we're not going to stand for this. We're going to, the legal system still applies to basketball arenas or hockey arenas or the football field or the pitches in soccer and that kind of thing. So, sports are not exempt from the law. They are part and parcel to the societies and the culture in which they're embedded, and that includes the legal codes. And criminal violence it's one of those things that sounds very easy, but it's not always. How do you define premeditated? How do you define assault? Marty McSorley, basically what he did is he swung his hockey stick like a baseball bat and hit Donald Brashear in the temple and knocked him out, and then he went flying to the ice and his head bounced on the ice, and that was just kind of one of those really gruesome things. Now this little scenario over here with Moore and Bertuzzi is kind of interesting because they had been going at it for a while during this particular hockey game, and so Moore, there's a breakaway and starting to come down this way, and Bertuzzi said, he's like, what I was going to do is I was going to come up, I was going to punch him, and I was going to ride, kind of tackle him and ride him to the ground. We were going to get into fisticuffs, maybe some 5-minute majors, but it was going to be settled. Okay, so there is an act of premeditation there. But as he swings this fist, because Moore is streaking down this way on the ice and he's following up behind him, he swings, well, that fist, as he says, inadvertently hits him in the temple and knocks him out. So then when he jumps on his back and puts his forearm kind of in the back of his neck and is driving him to the ice, as seen down here, Moore's body is limp, and so it's not able to protect itself, and he ends up breaking his neck and some severe injuries like that. Okay, there was a call for, to think of this as a crime, to arrest the individual, to prosecute it as a crime. It's not that simple. I mean, lawyers have to go through the same process as they would with an assault case or something like that. A homicide in terms of premeditated, was it not? So manslaughter 1 versus 2 and all that kind of stuff. It's very, very difficult. You can think of players involving fans. Oftentimes that is going to have a bit of a criminal violence component to it. And you're like, well, but that involves people off the field or off the, and that's true to some extent, and that's why these categories are wonderful. They give us something to think about, but they're not perfect because what constitutes violence is not this static thing. It's very, very much a dynamic result of the human condition involving competition and aggression and emotions and all that kind of stuff. But nonetheless, what it does do is it provides us an opportunity to evaluate everything, to start and try to separate the type of violence that happens within a sporting contest. What role does money have with all this? I mean, it seems at first very easy to say, well, okay, commercialization and money is a direct antecedent or cause for violence in sport. However, we know there is a bit of a relationship there, okay, but we cannot draw conclusively that that money influences violence and directly causes violence, because, I mean, if you think about it, there's a lot of violence in sport that's not on TV. Now, with YouTube, we're able to see these clips, but it's ex post facto. It's after the fact. And so it's hard to say if these people were trying to show off for the cameras, engage in this, and try to garner some modicum of internet and YouTube stardom. I mean, maybe there is, but if you think about something like high school football and some of the violence that occurs in there, there's a lot of people there, yes, but you don't necessarily have this mass media presence at these more scholastic-based events. Also, I guess you should ask the question, we want to blame things on violence, we want to blame it on money, but since our society and our culture is very violent, I mean, why would there be any difference with our sports? And also, do we really want to stop all the violence in sports? Maybe we want to curb it to some extent to make sure that the game and the participants are safe, and then the game is a marketable game that can be, you know, sold and packaged to millions of consumers. But to some extent, with something like football, you know, there's a kind of a visceral, athletic, brutal component to it. And I'm not proud of this, but, you know, guilty as charged. If I'm sitting there watching a Packer game, and, you know, the Packers, you know, deliver some sort of big hit on an opposing team, I'm going to probably get excited, and there's something that kind of just tugs viscerally at me, and your first reaction is to kind of, ooh, ah, oh my God, and there's kind of a cheering that goes on, and or maybe even a kind of a laughter, and oh, come on, but we're sort of excited as well, and that's that whole thing that, you know, we're talking about these dynamics of violence and deviance in this particular section, but you know, humans are different. They're difficult. It's tough to go through and understand how and why we do what we do. It's not such a static thing, and a lot of these categories are static. So what you want to do is you want to combine as many categories or variables together to create a holistic understanding or explanation for something as multifaceted as violence. And so, all right, violence, what are some other sociological ideas that are associated with violence or help to explain it? Gender, social class, race, this is kind of the holy trinity of social science. And obviously here they provide some input and provide us a lot of important information. Here's an example of all these things kind of coming together. A guy named Messner is at USC, and he's done a lot of great work in sport, in gender, and then understanding kind of the masculine experience and all that kind of thing. And if you put them all together, this is something he came up with. He did some research and noticed that men from low economic areas and minority group backgrounds placed an importance on this whole idea of respect. It's kind of like a social commerce that athletes have. And so respect is very, very important. And if you think of someone like Dr. Ruby Payne that talks about the culture of poverty, and if you don't have a lot of material possessions, then your personal respect, or maybe even more important, the disrespect, that becomes almost like a commodity that can be exchanged. It becomes something very, very powerful, very important, and can be a kind of a jumping off point for violent behavior for a lot of different people. Well, these individuals that Messner was talking about, kind of up here in the first point, they are more likely than their white counterparts to use intimidation, aggression, and violence while in sports. All right, and a lot of this is associated with that whole idea of respect that we were just talking about. and that sport is more than just a game. It's a representation. It's kind of a small struggle that represents this whole idea of life as well. These individuals tend to be funneled into sports as a means, the primary means for changing and transcending their social circumstances. All right, and so there's a lot riding on this particular skill, this particular play, this particular game, be it football, basketball, whatever. There's a lot riding on it. As a result, these people, if it's more important, and not important in terms of, well, they want to win more as compared to, you know, people in the suburbs or whatever. No, that's not necessarily what we're trying to get at. It's just that there's so much riding on this athletic opportunity, they're more likely to use all these different strategies, aggression and intimidation, as at their disposal, because they need to succeed, whatever success is defined to them as. Well, okay, as that happens, a lot of people then assume that you're productive in this sport. You come from, let's say you come from a low economic area that has a high crime rate. So you come from a violent area, you participate in a violent sport. The assumption is that you're a violent person. You're funneled into football, for example, as a way to deal with your rage and aggression, almost kind of like Mike Tyson. You know, they said he was just a real angry kid, so they put him in boxing, and it kind of worked out well for him. Well, keeping in mind that, you know, boxing, there is strategy. It's not just pure rage and going out and trying to, you know, demolish or destroy the person across from you. And so whenever Mike Tyson had a lot of structure and strategy with certain trainers, he was much more productive. So it's not, you know, certain violent sports are not just this anarchy of violence that automatically is going to necessarily mean that they're going to be productive, efficient, and successful. But, you know, there's this whole notion that kind of that famous picture of Mike Tyson as he's, you know, handcuffed and wearing his suit and a little trench coat over his arms, and he's going to jail and all that kind of stuff. And a lot of people sort of assume that if you're involved in boxing, if you're in MMA, if you're involved in something like football or rugby, you know, you're just going to be more predisposed as a male to being violent. That, however, not necessarily the case. We can find a lot of anecdotal evidence that says, you know, the athletes are involved in different types of things like sexual assaults or whatever, but to draw a statistically significant relationship between those two is very difficult. So a lot of it depends upon your kind of point of view. The National Coalition Against Violent Athletes right here is a website, a repository, an organization that was designed by someone who's the victim of domestic and sexual violence from a student athlete, and so she took it upon herself to start this almost like consortium where you can find all this information linking and relating to this whole idea of violent athletes. Well, keep it in mind, if you go onto that website, you're going to get a lot of information that says athletes are violent. Well, if you go to other places, that's going to be downplayed. If you go to something like Bad Jocks, which is just, it's purely almost entertainment, okay? And you get on there and you look and just kind of see how things are covered. The one thing we can say is there's violence and deviance being perpetrated by athletes, managers, coaches, etc. within the institution of sport. That being said, kind of the big million-dollar question is, are those rates of violence different than similar demographic rates, age, gender, race, ethnicity, things like that, in the general population? That's much stickier to answer, and we just don't have those clear numbers yet. People tend to, and with good reason, when you start looking at and understanding male violence off the field against women, it's one of those things that it's a little case study that juxtaposes the idea of violence, sports, how violence can promote sort of this unstructured masculinity and aggression, and how it manifests itself. And so you kind of want to watch these things. And what we do know is that male athletes in many sports, not just power and performance sports, but primarily, it's extremely masculine, and so as a result, that is something that's part of their identity, and it tends to influence not only the interactions that they have with other males, but also the interactions that they have with other females. And especially as you ascend to the professional ranks, for example, a lot of these male athletes, they kind of close ranks in sort of a fraternal bonding, and they start to see women as outsiders that are trying to creep into their little network. Well, and so what you get is that secret society mentality of us versus them, which is very, very, very powerful. And because women are going to be depersonalized, they're seen as objects for sexual gratification, and if they are people, they're people that are trying to get something from the athlete. And so there's this kind of very, they're very leery. Also, the thing that's interesting is that you're going to have institutional support that does not hold elite athletes accountable. Jimmy Johnson in the 90s, and I'm going way back here, but the 90s, those Dallas Cowboy teams in the NFL, very, very successful, some Super Bowls and NFC championships and that kind of thing. And Jimmy Johnson was on record as saying that, his star players had different rules than, the backup center or the punter and the kicker. The idea being, I've got rules, and you need to obey them. Unless you're Michael Irvin or, whomever, Nate Newton. And then, we have a slightly different set of rules for them because they're a little bit more important. And so he was open about the hierarchy and how the rules apply to them. Well, okay, you have these individuals that get in trouble, and then they don't receive sanctions because they are star players and very important to the team's success. And so you kind of gloss over that. Well, that, just like a little kid, it kind of helps to emphasize or enable the fact that you can get away with some things and you're not really going to be punished. What about spectator violence? We've talked a lot about athletes and things like that, but I think we've all can probably think of some examples of violence that occurs outside of just athletes and coaches and that kind of thing. And so spectator violence, I think, is kind of interesting. There's not a ton of research on it. There's been some research done with social movements and collective behaviors and that kind of things, hysteria, so on and so forth. We know that Western Europe and soccer, there's kind of a tradition of hooliganism and that kind of thing. Well, from that kind of literature base, we see that non-contact sports have lower rates of violence from the spectators and vice versa. And that kind of makes sense. I mean, that's not completely out of bounds. One of the things that's kind of interesting is here in the United States, we have security measures and things like that that are very good, sound, and effective. But we've also been very lucky because we just don't have the kind of culture of spectator violence that other countries or other cultures around the world have had. Fan violence is fairly minimal when watching it on TV. That being said, they talk about in terms of domestic violence that the most number, kind of historically, the most number of domestic violence calls throughout the entire United States is on Super Bowl Sunday. So it's kind of the idea that people get very emotional, very upset, your team's losing, and then you go and you pop your wife or something like that. Sporting events, again, I guess we've had relatively decent amount of success. Now there's some old stories of there was a baseball game, professional baseball game in I think it was the 1880s, and they actually had to cancel the game because the fans became so unruly. Of course, back then you could carry your 6-shooter into the sporting event with you, and it wasn't quite the same as we have now with big stadiums and things like that. But they were so upset with the call that everyone was discharging their firearms into the air, and the players were upset because, as we know from our guy Sir Isaac Newton, what goes up must come down, which means those bullets, we have no idea where they're coming down. So we've come a long ways since the 1890s. But if you think about kind of now, the vast majority of American spectator fan violence occurs when during a celebration. Morgantown, West Virginia, Columbus, Ohio, these college towns that have kind of a history of celebratory fan violence. In Morgantown, what they do is they go and they set couches on fire. Well, okay, so let's take a couple of thousand college kids, some polyester couches, some gasoline, and a whole lot of liquor curds. Let's mix it up together every Saturday evening. You can kind of start to see how that would be a recipe for failure and not success. And then you see a lot, like Vancouver a couple years ago, people going through the streets and rioting, and there's kind of a collective mob mentality that takes over, and it's kind of interesting. Now, oftentimes, the sporting event is what we call the triggering event. It gets people up and going and brings them together. But then things that happen afterward, these collective behaviors, these riots, mass hysteria, tend to take on kind of an organic sense of themselves, and it's kind of like an amoeba working its way through the street, you know, and it's the energy and the dynamics, or that's what's keeping it alive, the individuals and the rage or the emotion. But overall, that stuff, you know, like I said, you know, we've been fairly lucky, and that hasn't, obviously there's been some horrible incidences here in the United States, but it's one of those things that Wakefield and Juan talk about the dysfunctional fan and how Major League Baseball has tried to you know, address dysfunctional fans and other things like that in ballparks and stadiums around the United States. Fandom, players, managers, coaches, sport managers for you all, it's going to be very interesting because you are the ones that have to deal with the behaviors and then the ramifications of these behaviors, whether it's with athletes or at a particular facility. What I tried to do in this particular module is just show you that, you know, understanding deviant behavior and then the corresponding violence and or criminal activity, these are all just separate concepts. And so when it comes to an organization trying to deal with whatever problems you have with your players or with your organizations, you'll be able to respond accordingly based upon these much more nuanced and advanced understandings for crime, deviance, and violence.